The whole cabin heard her when she snapped, "Move to the back. We don't serve people like you in this seat." The black pilot didn't move. His fists tightened, but his voice stayed calm, as if he'd practiced surviving this moment his whole life. Heads turned, but eyes slid away, like watching his humiliation was wrong, but also too familiar to be shocking. Slowly, he took out his pilot's badge, as if to remind them that being black doesn't cancel your right to belong. A child started to cry. A phone camera rose, and the air filled with that heavy silence that always follows naked racism. Then he spoke a single name, and from the way her face collapsed, everyone knew the real problem had never been his seat, only his skin. What happened next shocked everyone, and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below, and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. Daniel slept with the soft whir of the house fan above him and the faint, familiar scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen. He woke before dawn out of habit more than needed. 30 years in the air teaches your body to live by schedules, to rise while the world is still thinking about sleep. In the hallway, a small pair of sneakers waited by the door. Anna's, scuffed at the toes from a week of running with friends. He patted across the floor and kissed her forehead as she mumbled for 5 more minutes. At 38, Daniel carried the look of someone who had learned to hold both tenderness and tiredness in the same hands. He put on his father's old leather jacket, the lining worn thin where the left arm had rubbed for years, and felt for the tiny silver cross sewn into the right pocket, a small habit that steadied him. The jacket smelled like cedar and old maps. It had been gifted the day he passed his first pilot check ride, and he had never let it go. That jacket was more than fabric. It was proof. He drove the short way to the small airport, the town still wrapped in night. The control tower blinked like a lighthouse. Daniel's colleagues nodded in the kind of silence pilots use instead of words. He checked the plane with a practiced eye, touching panels and levers, speaking the ritual lines that turned machines into trustworthy partners. People often thought flying was only about metal and math. For Daniel, it was also about keeping promises to his daughter, to the men and women who trusted him with their lives, to the family who had risked everything so he could learn to breathe in altitude and calm. He clipped his badge to his shirt and felt the metal against his collarbone like a small, private anchor. At the small cafe near the hangars, he met Ethan, his closest friend from training, a man with quick laughter and easy counsel. Ethan tore into his breakfast and listened when Daniel spoke about Anna's upcoming recital and the client who had called him in the middle of the night last week. "You'll make the recital," Ethan said, and Daniel wanted to believe him. He had said the same promise last month and missed the whole thing because of a late assignment. The guilt still sat heavy. "You promised you wouldn't miss another." Ethan's eyes were steady in the way that makes you know someone will hold you to your word. Daniel wanted a friend who would push him, not flatter him. He had that in Ethan. What he did not know was how the shape of that loyalty might bend later. After the morning brief, Daniel walked through the jetway and greeted passengers with a calm smile. To them, he was a professional stranger. Crisp uniform, steady voice, the sort of person who offered confidence simply by standing at the front. But by the time the doors closed and the engines warmed, his mind was partly with Anna's recital and partly back to the phone call from his mother last week, a voice threaded with worry about bills and the steady ache of being alone since his father's death. He promised himself he would carve out time this month, make the shifts fit the family instead of letting the family always fit into holes. Was that even possible? On days off, Daniel tutored at the community center, teaching teenage kids how to read maps and understand the basics of aerodynamics. He wanted to hand down what had been handed to him, the ability to move past fear by learning how the world worked. The kids called him Captain, and some of them looked at him like he was a man who had stepped out of a magazine. One boy named Jamal looked at Daniel with the earnest hunger of a child who needed the world to make sense. Daniel saw his younger self in Jamal's hands, eager, nervous, bright. Those afternoons filled him and terrified him at once. He loved the work, but he feared the idea of letting down more young faces he'd already let down once. What would it mean if he failed them? At home, Anna drew pictures of airplanes and stuck them on the fridge with magnets shaped like stars. The kitchen counter held a stack of acceptance letters Daniel kept from the beginning of his career. Faded, creased, each one a small miracle. He would run his fingers over the dates, the stamps, the signatures, remembering the nights he had studied until his eyes burned. Those memories were part triumph, part cut he could trace like a scar. He loved flight, but he loved the ground too, the messy, noisy family life where words like sorry and I'm trying mattered more than any checklist. He was grateful for the small, ordinary failures that taught him honesty. Even in a life lived by timetables, surprises arrived. The airline was changing routes, and management hinted at new responsibilities for pilots who had shown leadership. The chance was career-making. It would mean longer flights and a schedule that might pull him away from Anna's piano recitals for a season. If he accepted, it could mean security and a better future for his mother. But it also might mean missing the small things he already promised himself he would attend. The choice felt like standing at a runway edge, looking down at a plane that might carry everything he wanted and take something important in return. Could he justify the trade? He kept his jacket folded at the foot of his bed, the silver cross tucked in its pocket. Every night he fingered it before sleep, as if by touch he could weigh decisions and make the right ones. He loved being a pilot. He loved the safety of rules and the simple certainty of thrust and lift. Yet he carried a quieter, more particular fear, the worry that no matter how many hours he logged, the world might still reduce him to something smaller, that people would see the color of his skin first and the man he was second. He had experienced small humiliations, the curt tone at a diner, the offhand questions on job applications, and learned to breathe through them. Still, the fear lived like a shadow at the edge of his days. Would it ever go away? Daniel noticed the first small thing on his tablet during the pre-flight checklist. A short line in the crew notes that did not belong. It was a sentence that could have been typed by a tired scheduler, clipped, official, bland, but the words carried an edge. Front cabin protocols reviewed. Ensure compliance. Nothing about what compliance meant, and nothing about who had reviewed it. He blinked, scrolled back to the roster. Sarah's name sat in the flight attendant column for the morning run. He shrugged and tapped it away. Pilots stayed out of cabin politics. Or, at least, he had always tried to. At the staff briefing later, the captain before him, a tall man with the slow voice of someone who loved giving orders, read the new route notes aloud. There was praise for customer experience, and a reminder that the front rows were premium. An older flight attendant named Marta nodded, like she had heard similar things before. Sarah, however, did not speak much. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and kept her eyes low. Once the meeting broke into quick, practical chatter, she stepped close enough to Daniel that he heard, in a tone meant for the kettle noise of the kitchen. New rules. We can't have the wrong kind of trouble up front. Daniel felt the words brush him like a cold breeze. He tried to smile and make it casual. What kind of trouble? He asked. Sarah's mouth tightened. You know, she didn't need to finish. The air felt suddenly smaller. Daniel thought of Jamal's question from the tutoring session 2 nights before. Do people change, Captain, or do they just get better at hiding? And it came back to him now, like a flat stone in a pond. Had people really changed, or were they only better at pretending? Would a rule about front cabin ever mean more than luggage? Could it ever mean a man's face? On the ramp, the loading crew joked and shoved a bag cart. Ethan slapped Daniel's shoulder as if nothing had shifted. Big day, eh? Management is sniffing around for pilots to move up. He grinned. You in the frame, man. Are you ready? Daniel wanted to say yes with the whole of himself. He wanted to promise Anna and his mother a steadier future. But he also carried the small, hollow worry of the day-to-day. how the world sometimes measured skill against a number that had nothing to do with skill. He kept his answers short. Ethan's laugh rattled, bright and easy. Still, as they walked toward the jet, Daniel felt a prickle of watchfulness he could not ignore. That afternoon, in the community center, Jamal turned a page slowly and said, "Captain, my teacher said pilots look a certain way. She says that people expect the man in front to be." He stopped. Daniel leaned closer and saw the boy searching for words that fit the world he saw on TV and in storybooks. Daniel told him simply, "People expect many things, Jamal. Sometimes they are wrong. Sometimes it takes one person to stand there and change what they expect." Jamal's eyes widened. "Will you always be the one to change it?" he asked. The question felt innocent. It felt heavy. Daniel did not promise perfection. He promised to try. Back at the crew room, Sarah cleaned a tray with a methodical hand. She had worked for years on the airline, and the job had taught her small rituals that steadied a shaky life. A coffee cup in the same place, a coin kept in a pocket for luck, a photograph of her mother folded into a wallet. Her husband had left 3 years ago and taken half the quiet the house held. Work was where she kept friction and shape. When a younger attendant laughed in the corner about a celebrity traveling in first class, Sarah's smile was automatic. Inside, something tightened. The world had become more complicated in ways she had not wanted. New hires came from places she did not know. Policies arrived with words that felt foreign. She had learned to measure strangers quickly. It made things easier. It made things feel safer. Yet that evening, a customer service bulletin appeared on her screen. It was meant to be routine, an update on premium seating etiquette. Somewhere in the jargon was a line about maintaining the premium experience for priority demographics. The words were awkward and left space for interpretation. Sarah read them twice, feeling something like permission and something like a warning. Did the company mean for her to act? Or was this just a miswritten sentence that would go away with time? Her thumb hovered over the acknowledgement button, and then she pressed it without thinking. The screen confirmed receipt. Later, in the quiet of the crew base, she would picture the acknowledgement like a small, nervous signature. Daniel's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number during boarding. The text was short, almost mechanical. Monitor passenger behavior. Priority seating standards apply. He frowned. Who had sent that? He called operations and was told it was an automated push. He tried to laugh it off, but the message left a residue. When he walked the cabin to greet passengers, he felt glances more than usual, small assessments that slid along his uniform and stopped somewhere behind his smile. A woman with a baby offered him a polite nod. A businessman pretended not to stare. Daniel's throat tightened for reasons he could not name. Had the world changed in the last hour, or had he only become more awake to the change? And then, as the jet filled and the engines began to hum, Sarah met his eyes across the aisle. For a moment, they were both just two work-worn faces in a busy metal tube. Then the small, old decision she had made since the bulletin, the one that felt safer and sharper than fear, rose in her like a reflex. A thought that seemed to say, preserve the front, protect the premium, keep things simple. Would a policy line and a private worry be enough to build the kind of cruelty that drops like cold rain? He held the metal badge out again, this time not like a simple proof, but like a fact that should settle the room. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm the captain on this flight. The words came quiet and precise, the kind of voice pilots use when they mean the plane and everyone in it to be safe. For a beat the cabin forgot to breathe. Sarah's hand trembled on the tray table. Her eyes darted from the badge to his face and back again, as if the two things could not possibly belong together. The name on the badge carried weight she did not feel ready to accept. People shifted. A man 2 rows back fumbled for his phone. A woman in a business suit clicked the camera app on her phone and pretended to check the time. The child who had started crying earlier wiped his nose with the sleeve of his sweater and stared like a witness. "You're joking," Sarah said. Her voice sounded too thin to be the one giving orders all morning, but her posture tried to hold the room steady. "You can't. This section is for passengers. You'll need to move to the rear." Daniel's throat tightened. He had imagined worse and better conversations 100 times in the quiet of night flights and long drives home. None of his rehearsed lines fit for what was happening now. He could step back and take a seat in the general cabin, write the complaint later, let the social noise die. Or he could stand there, with a uniform that meant something, and ask to be treated the way the airline's uniform promised every passenger would be treated. Which was it to be? Safety or silence? If you were in his place, what would you do? "Ma'am," he said, very calm, "I'm not a passenger. I've already completed the captain's briefing. This is my flight. I'm asking you politely for a bottle of water." The words hung in the filtered air-conditioned light like an invitation. A hush fell that had nothing to do with the engines. For a wild second, even Sarah seemed to have forgotten how to argue. Then, as if remembering a rule that could justify her nerves, she planted her chin and said, louder this time, "Sir, the policy is the policy. The front cabin is for paying passengers. You can't." Marta, the purser, stepped forward at the exact moment the aisle felt ready to crack. She had the company's badge, authority in the way older crew do, and an even older habit of measuring every situation by the manual first. "Let's keep this professional, please," Marta said. "Captain, please, take a seat while we complete boarding." The pull of hierarchy should have made the decision easy. A captain is the captain. Yet the room was no longer only about hierarchy. There were passengers watching, some with palms white on armrests, some gripping the arm of a loved one. A man in a dark suit cleared his throat and muttered, "We don't need trouble." Sarah's voice, small and fierce, carried an argument no manual had written. A fear of change, a lifetime of looking for danger in people who did not fit her picture. Daniel looked at Marta, then at Sarah. The choice did not feel military. It felt personal. If he sat down, he would leave the humiliation unchallenged in the moment. He could file a complaint later, take proof of what happened, and try to make good through forms and email chains. But he also knew how easily things could be erased by inboxes and time. If he stood up, insisted on being served, he risked inflaming the cabin, causing pushback that could mean delays or worse. Either way, a small hand on his conscience tightened. He took a breath. "I will not sit down and let this go," he said. The voice was steadier than he felt. "I will not move. If there is a complaint, it will be noted by operations. But right now, in this cabin, we follow the rules the airline expects us to follow. All passengers are treated with respect, and we do not refuse service based on who someone is." A ripple went through the rows like a small wind. A man who'd been pretending not to watch turned his phone to record properly. A woman near the window whispered, finally. Sarah's face fell into a shade that looked to Daniel like both fear and something harsher. The fast, hot flush of being exposed. That was when the woman in the business suit stood up. Her voice cut through, bright and precise. "She's right about the policy," she said, to the surprise of everyone. "If the airline has a premium seating rule, it should be enforced. We paid for those seats." Her words were shielded by cash and the kind of certainty money buys. Heads turned toward her and then away, like a cautious tide. The cabin became a chessboard where small moves counted. Daniel felt something ache in him he could not name. Anger, hurt, the tired weight of having to prove his right to exist in the same world as those who measured value by color. The badge on his chest felt heavier now. He could feel his daughter's picture in his wallet, the one Anna drew of him, and a plane with big, smiling windows. He thought of Jamal at the community center asking about how people change. This was not just an argument about seats. This was whether the world could accept him fully and still be the world he wanted Anna to grow up in. A passenger 2 rows back, a young man with a voice that jumped, shouted, "Hey, Captain, Just sit." The shout was meant to be a release for everyone who wanted the plane to move on, for flights not to become battlegrounds. It landed like a stone. Daniel's face must have shown everything, because a woman across the aisle, an older teacher-looking woman whose hands were clasped, reached forward and squeezed his sleeve. "You do what you must," she said softly, eyes bright. "We'll back you." For a moment, the plane held two possible futures. One where Daniel sat and filed forms, and another where he stood and forced the airline to reckon with its people in real time. Marta's jaw worked. Sarah's hands clenched. The engines hummed like an impatient animal. The captain's decision would decide whether the flight would proceed quietly or become a story passengers would tell for years. Daniel swallowed. He felt the small silver cross at his chest like a hot stone, a memory that steadied him. He made his choice, not loud, not theatrical, simply certain. "I'm staying," he said, "and I'm asking you to serve me like any other passenger." The announcement of his decision felt small. It felt enormous. People's faces shifted again, some relieved, some angry, some watching for the next move. In the galley, someone clicked the intercom, fingers trembling. The flight had tilted from routine to consequence in a single breath. What would happen next? The cabin held its breath for a long beat after Daniel's choice. Somewhere behind the hum of the engines, a child asked a question and was hushed. Daniel felt his heart thud in a rhythm that had nothing to do with flying, anger, shame, and a strange, electric clarity that made everything else seem small. He placed his hand on the back of the seat in front of him, as if he could steady more than just his own body. Faces watched him like a slow tide. His mouth tasted of metal. He had been trained to measure risk in numbers, but this felt like a different math. Humiliation plus history plus responsibility. What did he do next? Marta moved like someone who had done hard things and lived through them. She had authority and the patience of someone who remembered that policy could sometimes be a shield and sometimes a trap. "Captain," she said quietly, "let me handle the announcement. We'll keep things calm." Her voice did not seek drama. It offered procedure. Daniel nodded and felt gratitude for the steadiness she offered, gratitude, and a small, raw need for proof that this moment would not be flattened by time and inboxes. He needed witnesses and a paper trail. He needed the world to remember that the man who wore the uniform was not a problem to be moved. His first plan formed in those fast, bright moments: collect evidence, keep the cabin calm, and make the complaint official as soon as radios cleared. He would ask Marta to page operations and to log his statement. He would politely request that the passengers who had started recording save their videos and hand them to a purser after landing. He would speak once to the cabin in the firm, measured cadence pilots used when they wanted control without anger. If you were sitting there, what would you have done? He asked himself that, too, and then set the question aside to act. Marta stepped to the intercom and spoke in a voice that asked for order and gave none of the fight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be completing boarding shortly. We ask for your cooperation. Please remain seated while we proceed." The announcement was thin armor, but it bought time. The woman who had stood up earlier, the one in the suit, folded her arms and looked like someone who had not expected to be told to be quiet. The teacher-looking woman who had squeezed his sleeve, Daniel learned her name was Grace, sat straighter. And when Marta finished, she leaned forward and said, "We saw you. I'll sign anything you need." Her eyes were gentle but fierce. Daniel felt a small, steady warmth at that promise. He took the water and thanked the cabin as if nothing unusual had occurred. The bottle was cool in his hand. He wanted to keep the tone calm because escalation could ruin everything. Delay the flight, give management a reason to write him up for causing trouble, or worse, create the very chaos some passengers feared. His mind flicked to the note about management looking for pilots to move up. He had an interview with the leadership team next month. A complaint or a delay logged against his name could tilt that decision. The stakes were clear now. Dignity and truth on one side, the fragile career ladder and his family's future on the other. If he lost that opportunity, his mother's quiet plans for stability might fall apart. Time, suddenly, pressed at his shoulders like a hand. While Marta radioed operations, Daniel sent a brief text to Ethan. He wrote nothing of the fight, only a short line. On Flight 317. Might need you to back me up if this goes to ops. It felt odd to involve a friend in an airline dispute, but he wanted allies. He pictured Ethan's easy grin and steady counsel, and hoped the man would not be the one to disappoint him. He already knew life could make people change in small, hurtful ways. He had learned to keep some trust close and some cautious. He could not know which friend would bend and which would break. A passenger near the aisle, the young man who had shouted earlier, kept his phone low, the red dot of recording still glowing. Daniel approached him and asked quietly, "Could you save the clip? Hold on to it for us." The man's face softened. "Yeah, sure," he said. "This is something." For a moment Daniel felt the tug of something like relief. Ordinary people, he thought, would be the witnesses. The law of witnesses had always worked in strange ways. Those who watch sometimes remember differently, sometimes more sharply. Would the recordings tell the same truth everyone felt in that pressurized air? Then the operations reply came over Marta's headset, crisp and a little tight. Flight 317, operations. Please de-escalate. We are monitoring. Avoid delays. There was no support in that message, only a corporate instruction to smooth things over. It landed like a cold hand. Daniel understood implicitly that management's idea of monitoring was different from his. They wanted the plane out on time, not headlines. He felt the plan narrowing. He could insist and risk being blamed for delaying the flight, or he could accept a paper complaint that might or might not change policy. Which would better protect his family and his career? A text blinked on his phone from Anna. "Daddy, don't be late for my recital. Miss you." The words were small and clenched, and for a second Daniel's jaw hurt harder than pride or anger. The B-plot of his life, the piano recitals, the missed promises, the small hands that trusted him, folded into this moment and sharpened every choice. He imagined Anna looking for him in the crowd, counting chairs, waiting for the sound of his boots. He had to think not only about himself, but about the long bar he would leave for her, whether to teach her to stand up or to teach her how to hide when things got messy. He looked at Marta, at Grace, and at the rows of faces waiting for him to decide. He decided to follow through with the first plan. Keep composure, gather witnesses, make the complaint official, and document everything. He would not let humiliation be the final note of the morning. He would not let the story be smoothed into an afterthought. As he moved to begin the formal logging of events, a woman in uniform, an operations rep whose badge he did not recognize, entered the jetway and scanned the cabin with a polite, practiced gaze. Her smile was bright, her manner helpful. She offered her card and said she would take particulars after departure. Daniel felt a surge of relief that quickly cooled into an odd chill. Some faces in the room looked exactly the way help should look. Others, he had learned, sometimes hid loyalties that bent when the wind shifted. He had a plan and friends beside him, and yet a small, insistent part of his mind whispered that plans sometimes fold in on themselves at the worst moment. He could not be certain this would go as he hoped. For a few hours after the announcement, the cabin hummed in a strange truce. People folded themselves back into seats, conversations shrinking to cautious whispers. Daniel moved through that hush with a purpose he had not felt in years. Collect, log, protect. The young man with the saved video came forward after the seatbelt light winked off and handed his phone to Marta. "Keep it," he said. "I'll back you up if they need me." Marta copied timestamps and wrote down names. Grace signed a small statement on a napkin and handed it to Daniel with a look that felt like an oath. The things that mattered were small and human, a signature, a saved clip, a witness who would not shrink away. Could these small things ever be enough to hold the truth steady? Ethan arrived unexpectedly before takeoff, slipping into the jump seat with a grin that tried to be ordinary and failed because he knew Daniel too well. He had dialed operations, he said, and a supervisor had listened. They told me to stand by, not to escalate, Ethan reported. His voice carried relief for a beat and then an edge. He was careful to make the company happy and careful to stay Daniel's friend. They talked in clipped sentences under the roar of engines. What to say to ops, what to insist on when on the ground, who to contact legally. Daniel felt the small bright lift of having allies. It was a victory, fragile as glass. How long before someone lost patience with the glass? The operations rep who had stepped aboard earlier came over with a pocket notebook and a smile that tried to be neutral. She promised a written report and an internal review. "We take complaints seriously," she said, as if reciting a creed. Her words sounded right. Marta handed over the saved clip and the napkin statement. The rep's pen moved across her form. Daniel breathed easier for a few minutes, tasting a victory that was simple and clean. Someone in authority had taken note. But when the rep stepped away and tapped something into her tablet, Daniel saw the tiny notch of worry in her eyes. She looked over at Marta, then at Sarah, then away. For a moment he caught the impression of calculations, the airline weighing time, headlines, and cost. Was the promise of a formal report only paper thin? On the ground after the flight, the crew moved quickly. Passengers filed off with the air of people eager to close the moment like a book. A reporter for a small local news site, wearing a lanyard that read freelance, had been on the jet and approached as people disembarked, asking questions with professional curiosity bordering on hunger. Daniel answered carefully, short and true, while Marta and the rep gave formal versions of events. The young man who recorded let the journalist know he had footage. The journalist smiled like a person who smelled a story. Daniel felt the small victory curdle into something complicated. The truth might leave the room and become a headline shaped by someone else's slant. How would his family read the story the next morning? That evening, at home, Daniel sat with Anna's colored plane drawing spread on the table. He felt tired in a new way, like someone who had boxed a fight and waited for the bruise to turn color. Ethan texted that management had taken note and would file the internal complaint, but there was also a line about avoid escalating to press. The words felt like a gentle nudge to lower the heat. Daniel stared at the silver cross in his jacket pocket and thought about timing. The promotion interview next month, his mother's rent, Anna's recital. The small victory had given him evidence, witnesses, and a formal report, but it had also put him on a map that management might read in their own way. Could truth survive the pressures of time and office politics? Across town, Sarah sat in her small kitchen and ran a hand across the edge of the counter until her knuckles whitened. She had obeyed a whisper of company policy and then felt the world tilt when the whisper met a man who could not be dismissed. The saved footage, the signatures, the operations rep's note, these were the things she feared most because they would not let her forget. Her vulnerability pressed in. Her husband had left, bills stacked up, and the new rules felt like a lifeline she could grab to keep order in a life that had become brittle. A message blinked on her phone from a private group chat, a place where attendants vented and traded tips, that said only, handled, keep front clean. A single word, and a kind of pressure to conform pressed on her chest. If policy felt like permission, could that permission ever be walked back without losing face? That night, as news of the onboard confrontation threaded through small community forums, and a friend in the local aviation union messaged Daniel to say he'd seen the clip, a harder shadow revealed itself. The journalist who had been on the flight published a short piece online before midnight, shaped with a headline that favored conflict and readers' clicks. The saved video was crisp and real, but the angles chosen made Daniel look confrontational to a hurried eye. Comments multiplied, some supportive and raw, others quick to judge without knowing. In the small hours, Daniel thought of Jamal and the boy's wide, trusting eyes. He thought of Anna finding a headline that might twist a father's steadiness into something else. The small success of having witnesses and paperwork had not erased the world's readiness to reframe truth. Would the thing he fought for on the plane survive once the story left his hands? The evidence arrived like a quiet blow the next morning. Not a roar, but a slow, patient collapse of the picture Daniel had been holding. He woke before dawn to an email from a pilot he barely knew, Marcus Hale, whose flights often skirted international routes, and who had a reputation for not liking noise. "Call me when you can," the subject line read. When Daniel answered, Marcus didn't waste breath. "There's an internal memo," Marcus said. "Someone in the corporation pushed it through last month. It wasn't supposed to go public. It was supposed to be a guideline. It's worse than a guideline." Daniel's stomach dropped in a way his training didn't cover. He felt the morning tilt. Marcus sent the file. Daniel opened it with hands that suddenly went cold. The memo was full of soft corporate language, the kind of jargon that makes guilt sound like policy. Enhance premium customer experience. Prioritize front cabin demographics. Implement soft seating management measures where appropriate. Underneath, a chain of emails threaded like teeth. A regional vice president pressing for measurable action after complaints from a recurring set of premium clients. An operations manager forwarding a list of suggested measures, a line that read plain and bureaucratic. Crew to be reminded to enforce premium seating standards as necessary. The kicker was a short note from someone in Sarah's immediate chain. "We need to protect premium clients. This applies to boarding conduct. Please ensure compliance." It landed on Daniel like a new kind of grief. Everything in the cabin replayed: Sarah's hands, Marta's hesitation, the woman in the suit who had risen with the authority of money. The scene shifted under him. He had been angry at Sarah, at her face, at the little cruelty that felt stolen from history's old chapters. Now he saw a new line running behind it. The company had given a soft green light to behavior that could be read as discrimination. The policy hadn't fallen from the sky. It had been sculpted in an office, polished into acceptable language, and sent down the chain. Sarah had not acted in a vacuum. Daniel called Marta, whose voice, when it came, was small and flat. "We suspected something," she said, "but I didn't expect the corporation to write it." Her words were a slow, deflating thing. Marta had been the shield on the plane. The discovery made her feel hollowed. She had protected order because that was her job, and the job had always been allowed to feel like the only way to safety. Now she had evidence that the safety she'd been taught to keep might have been a mask for something ugly. The first twist did not simplify anything. If anything, it multiplied the hurt. People Daniel had begun to judge were suddenly visible in a different light. Not only perpetrators, but also pressured actors. Employees given impossible choices by a system that valued profit and comfort over dignity. Sarah's late-night message to the attendant chat, handled, "Keep front clean," began to look less like casual cruelty and more like the frightened scrawl of someone trying to keep a job, a mortgage, or the quiet roof over her head. Daniel felt his outrage split into strands, toward the company that had written the memo and toward the woman who had executed it. Which anger had the stronger claim? Marcus gave him more, a name attached to the push, an email from a regional vice president who had looped in the airline sales team after a set of premium passenger feedbacks. Daniel read it twice. The language in those memos was careful, measured, melting away moral weight with neutral nouns and bullet points. But the effect was plain. An instruction that left room for prejudice to act in the dark. It gave cabin staff something to hide behind, the ambiguity of premium experience as an excuse for exclusion. Daniel felt dizzy. He remembered Jamal at the community center asking whether people really changed or just hid their faces better. The memo said something different. Sometimes systems hide their cruelty behind polite phrases. Daniel imagined the night Sarah sat on her couch in silence after the flight, feeling both justified and suddenly terrified. Had she been told, subtly, she would be punished for not protecting customers who expect a certain standard, Has that expectation been coded to mean something uglier than cleanliness or quiet? He thought of a woman in the suit again, the one who had spoken for the rose like someone who owned the air. A check of social media, suggested by the thread Marcus had sent, revealed another layer. The woman had family ties to a major donor list for the airline's loyalty program, a frequent flyer who'd complained about unruly passengers in a private email to the VP. The complaint was polite on its face, but the language echoed the memo's phrasing. The more Daniel saw, the clearer the architecture became. Privileged nudging policy, policy nudging staff. Staff forced into choices that left ordinary human beings on the ground. What did this mean for Sarah? Marcus's voice softened when he said, "She might be more victim than villain." It was a sentence that did not settle well in Daniel's chest. He had wanted simple justice, a clear perpetrator to punish, a clear wrong to right. Instead, he found how fast complexity filled any neat moral shape. He felt the anger he'd harnessed on the plane turn into something like responsibility, not only to clear his own name and dignity, but to demand change where it started. The revelation was a gift and a curse. It gave Daniel the lever he needed to point at the system rather than just the woman. But it also complicated his human responses. How could he stand in righteous anger and also reach toward someone who had been cornered? How could he protect his family, his career, and also the dignity of a woman who might have acted out of fear? He wondered, too, about the journalist's piece that had already begun to shape public opinion. Would the memo, if made public, change how readers saw the plane and everyone in it, the crew and the passengers alike? Daniel sat with the file open and the small silver cross in his hand. He thought of his mother and Anna and Jamal and their quiet expectations of him. There was a new plan forming, not only to document and contest what happened on the plane, but to follow the thread upward, to show how policies made in glass offices could become cruelty in cramped cabins. He knew this would make enemies in places he could not see yet, and that some people would ask why he hadn't simply gone home and let the complaint run its slow course. But he also knew that once the truth had changed shape in his mind, he could not pretend it was still the old, simpler thing. The first major twist had pulled back a curtain and revealed a room full of people making choices, some cruel, some frightened, many blinded by language that dressed preference like policy. Daniel closed the file gently. He felt raw, uncertain, certain in a new way. The fight would not be only about a bottle of water or a seat. It would be about words that hide weapons. What would you have done if you saw the same memo? After the memo, the days felt thicker. Daniel found himself moving through them with a carefulness that made ordinary things new again, closing the front door slower so Anna could keep sleeping, making extra coffee because his mother liked 2 sugars, checking the calendar 3 times. He arranged a short meeting with Ethan at the diner by the hangar, the place where pilots traded stories and sometimes traded courage. Ethan arrived in his usual hurry, a paper cup steaming in his hand, his grin trying to be the same as always. He sat down and listened without interrupting as Daniel explained the memo, the video, the witnesses, and the weight of what it meant. Ethan's face went still in the way it did when he truly thought. "That's rotten," he said, simple and fierce. He reached across the table and tapped Daniel's hand once, a small, loyal touch. "We'll take this up. I'll be there in the meetings. I'll back you." The promise was easy to offer and harder to keep, but he meant it at that moment. Daniel felt the old relief of friendship settle into his chest, a warm, human anchor. Could one friend be enough to stand between a man and the slow machinery of reputation? They plotted practical things, who to speak with at the union, what records to save, how to keep the narrative grounded in facts and witness statements rather than anger. Ethan suggested a phone call to an old contact in law and offered to go with Daniel to the regional office. "You don't have to fight them alone," he said. His words were steady and plain. Daniel felt the burden ease, little by little. At night, he lay awake thinking of how easy it had been to trust Ethan, the man who'd laughed with him through check rides, who knew the cadence of his sarcasm, and the way he put his coffee down when he was worried. That trust felt like part of the safety he wanted to hand Anna, people who kept their word. Meanwhile, Marta became another quiet pillar. Over a bowl of late-night soup at the crew lounge, she told Daniel about a time long ago when she had to choose between a manual and a human. Her voice thinned when she described the faces she had seen over the years. Frightened staff, passengers who'd relied on kindness, and managers who preferred decisions in neat boxes. "I've made choices I'm not proud of," she said, hands wrapped around the warm bowl. "Sometimes we do what keeps the engine running." The confession was not for forgiveness so much as for truth. Daniel heard in it the weight of her years and the lonely calculus she'd learned in the galley. Marta's vulnerability was a soft thing. It made her presence feel more like a hand at his shoulder than a shield. At home, Daniel tried to show Anna the same steadiness. He practiced the lines he might say at the company meeting and then folded them away when his daughter asked if he'd come to the recital. "I'll be there," he promised aloud, because she needed the promise more than the proof. After she fell asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with her drawing of a smiling plane and the small cross in his palm. The B-plot threaded quietly through these nights. The fear that being brave now might cost him the small, daily things he'd promised: recitals, school drop-offs, a mother's rent. He had to weigh public truth against private promises. Which would be the better legacy for Anna? Grace, the older passenger who had squeezed his sleeve on the plane, became another unexpected ally. She sent a message offering to write a more formal witness statement and, surprisingly, to attend Anna's recital if Daniel was delayed. "No child should wait for a parent who has stood up for what's right," she wrote. Her note felt like a small lamp lit on a stormy night. Daniel accepted the offer with relief so sharp it surprised him. He had not expected strangers to become scaffolding, but here they were, a teacher, a diner friend, an older purser, a young man with a saved video. The network grew like a map, each name a dot of light. Across town, Sarah's life was unspooling under different lights. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at the mortgage notice until the words blurred. The group chat, in which attendants traded tips, had turned a corner. What had been offhand reassurance became a tightening ring of expectation. Her thumb hovered over replies and then typed too quickly, then deleted. At night, she pressed her forehead to the cool window pane and thought about the morning in the cabin. The badge, the captain's calm, the way the plane had held its breath. She had always measured strangers in seconds, had built a quiet armor out of small judgments to get through a world that sometimes felt unsafe. But now the armor felt heavy and sharp at once. Sarah called her sister and, for the first time in months, let the words tumble out. The fear of losing a job, the echo of her husband's leaving, the strange gratitude she felt for a policy that made decisions smaller and handed her the semblance of control. "I don't know who I was when this started," she admitted. "I thought I was protecting people. Now I feel like I protected the wrong thing." The confession left her raw. Her sister's voice was steady and practical, asking about payments they could defer and reminding Sarah that having made a bad choice did not make her a bad person. The words did not erase the shame, but they gave a route back to something like honesty. That honesty was fragile. One night, Sarah stood at the head of the crew base and watched the sky, thinking of Marta and of a younger woman she used to be before fear stacked its little bricks around her. She had a flash of the child she once was, playing by a river, who'd learned to pick her path by watching others. Was she beyond redemption, or could she be taught another way? The question hovered like a distant plane's contrail, visible and dissolving. Daniel's inner life shifted in small, seismic ways. The first plan he had made, collect evidence and file complaints, grew into something more strategic. He met with a lawyer the union helped arrange, and together they sketched out possible paths: public hearings, internal arbitration, a press strategy that kept the story anchored in facts rather than fury. He rehearsed statements with Ethan and with Marcus, who had become a confidant of sorts. Marcus warned that going up the chain meant enemies in neat suits and slow mailboxes. "They will try to make it messy," Marcus said. "They'll test your stamina." Daniel imagined being tested and felt a quiet, stubborn readiness bubble up. Was stamina the same as courage, or only its long, cruel cousin? Small moments kept him human. Anna's drawings on the fridge, Marta's late-night soup, Grace's offer, Ethan's steady presence. Each one built a web that felt protectively ordinary. Daniel thought of Jamal and the map classes, of teaching a boy how the sky held things up, and he realized this fight was also lessons. What do you do when the sky seems to tilt? Do you teach the next generation to fold or to stand? By the end of the week, the network had lines of loyalty and soft, worrying shadows. Friends promised support. Strangers offered to help. The company's messaging moved in slow, practiced tones about fairness and review. Daniel slept less, but he slept with a plan. The part of him that was afraid of losing career ground and missing recital notes remained awake and careful. The part that had to be brave stepped forward every morning. He did not know which part would carry him through what came next. He only knew he would not walk it alone. The call came on a gray morning, when rain stitched the airport windows with thin silver. Daniel read the sender line twice before his fingers found the screen. Ethan. He thought of the diner, the laugh, the way Ethan had promised to stand in meetings and call old friends legally. He opened the message with the small, steady faith of a man who kept his friends close in storms. The first line made his chest drop. Spoke with ops. "We can close this quietly. Don't make it messy for Anna. Trust me." Beneath that was an attachment, a short memo from HR offering confidential resolution and cordially consideration for anyone willing to cooperate. Daniel scrolled, then scrolled again. There on the page, in language both generous and cold, was an offer. Cross signed the settlement, accept a modest goodwill payment, and the company would handle internal training and close the matter without escalation. It sounded like mercy written by lawyers. But the deeper cut was the footnote. Support from colleagues who witnessed the event will be influential in reaching a swift resolution. Daniel's breath hitched. He imagined Ethan's face at the diner, his hand across the table that had promised to be an anchor. He tapped the phone and called. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, Ethan answered. His voice was careful, practiced, the same tone pilots used when the radio gave bad weather and they had to speak plainly. "Listen, Danny. They're offering a lot. For you too. For me." Ethan's quick syllables sounded like excuses dressed for speed. "They said if I back the company line, say the event caused an unnecessary delay, they'll put me forward for a leadership slot. It's my family, Dan." The line between words and confession thinned. Daniel heard the hunger in Ethan's voice, a mortgage, a sick parent, a child's tuition. He heard the logic that had tempted him earlier and thought it was only a practical bargain. "You promised," Daniel said, the way one says prayers to a God who does not always listen. "You said you'd back me." "I can still help in other ways," Ethan replied. His voice tried for warmth, but landed flat. "I can speak to the union. I can." Then he stopped, the sentence folding into itself. Daniel imagined the ledger balancing in some manager's mind. One friend sold to secure another's future. He felt a coldness, like wind through an open cockpit. The betrayal did not arrive as a shouted confession. It arrived as small, steady paperwork. At the mediation table, the HR lawyer produced a typed witness statement that surprised him. Ethan's signature lay at the bottom of a page that described Daniel as escalating the situation and refusing reasonable instructions, language that shaped the narrative into cause and consequence, guilt and delay. The words twisted like wire. Daniel stared at the signature until the ink blurred. How could the man who had pressed his shoulder in the hangar now sign a document that cut at him? Ethan's eyes avoided Daniel's. He read from a script that sounded like corporate training. I felt Mr. Harper's insistence on staying created tension. I advised de-escalation. The sentence was a small betrayal dressed in polite aviation English. Daniel's voice, when he answered, kept its shape, measured, careful. Because anger could turn the room into a courtroom, and they both knew the cameras and memos would love that. Mr. Hale, he said quietly, you stood with me the night we sat and planned. Did you write that yesterday? Ethan's jaw worked. I wrote what I saw, he said. They asked me to be honest. The honesty was a blade. Daniel saw, too late, the shape of the offer, a leadership slot, favorable scheduling, a promise that would lift Ethan's family out of a long, tight place. The ledger had been paid. The friendship that had felt like an anchor snapped like a frayed cable. People in the room shifted like a single living thing. Marta's face went ashen. Marcus looked away and rubbed his forehead. The HR lawyer folded her hands, as if nothing in human life could disturb the neat stacks of paper on the table. Daniel felt the floor underneath him thin. It was not only the signed page, it was the echo of simpler betrayals, little choices stacked until they looked like a wall. How many promises had life asked them to trade for small mercies? Where did one draw the line? He left the mediation feeling hollow, as if someone had carved out the middle of him and left the edges. The city moved on, engines and buses, and errands unfolding with the cheerful cruelty of routine. Daniel went home and closed the door with a gentleness that felt like a ritual for grief. He sat at the kitchen table with Anna's drawing spread in front of him and let his head rest in his hands. The betrayal was not only professional. It cut into the personal ledger. Ethan's signature could be used to frame him as the troublemaker. A complaint framed that way could delay promotions and shadow his career for years. It could mean missed recitals, extra shifts, a mother's rent in arrears. The stakes came into focus with a hard, cold clarity. What would he lose if the narrative turned against him? In the small hours, he called Marcus, then Marta, then Grace. Each voice offered sympathy and practical help. None could fill the ache left by a friend who had crossed a line. Grace's voice was fierce and bright when she spoke. He'll feel it, she said sharply of Ethan. People who betray remember the nights they ate alone. It was meant as comfort, but it tasted thin. Daniel thought about confronting Ethan, about demanding what had been promised in the diner, about tearing the signed page into pieces and showing the world the man behind the name. But he knew fights played out in ways that were rarely clean. Tearing paper would not erase a signed word in a lawyer's file. His collapse came slow and private. He found himself sleeping later, waking later, missing calls, and then answering them with a voice that sounded like someone else. A notice arrived from the airline. An internal note that the matter would be closed via settlement if no further evidence was provided within 7 days. The clock loomed. The small network he had built felt suddenly fragile. One signature could tip a jury of managers who preferred tidy resolutions to long, uncomfortable reckonings. At night, he replayed conversations with Ethan, searching for warning signs he had missed. How many small choices had foretold this betrayal? A skipped lunch, a hurried apology, a diverted eye? Daniel wanted to be angry, to find righteous heat that would carry him through the next fight. Instead, he felt a heavier, quieter ruin. The sense he had been naive about the cost of truth. He had thought alliances were currency that kept flying hours light. He had discovered they could be perishable goods. There's a question that sits in the aftermath of every deep cut. Do you fold or fight? Daniel sat in that question's shadow and felt it press against the bed of his chest. He imagined Anna at her recital, the small, steady promise he'd made, and he thought of the long thread he wanted to leave for her, that dignity mattered even when the price was high. The betrayal from Ethan had stripped away some comforts, but it also sharpened the horizon. Who else would stand? Who would step forward when loyalty had been traded? Have you ever been let down by someone you trusted so completely it changed how you saw the world? Daniel wondered what his answer would look like if he wrote it on a page and left it where his daughter could find it. The betrayal had toppled him into a quiet collapse, but it had not yet ended him. The pieces were scattered, the map torn, and the coming days would ask whether he could pick up the map and draw new lines. The nights after the mediation were the hardest. Daniel woke to the small hours with his chest tight, as if someone had closed a hand around the place where his breath began. He let the house keep its quiet and walked the rooms with the hush of someone trying not to wake ghosts. Anna's drawing lay on the kitchen table, a plane with 2 big windows and a smiling pilot. He touched the pencil strokes, as if he could smooth out the worry with his fingers. Bills waited on the counter. The union's phone had a voicemail he had not listened to. Ethan's signature on that paper sat in his mind like a small, sharp stone. It was not just a work betrayal. It was an unraveling of the private ledger he kept of who to trust. How do you reconcile a friend's need with the cost it asks of you? He slept badly, then not at all. Some mornings he missed the alarm. Others he woke just in time to shave and walk out the door as if nothing had happened. At work, pilots talk about weather and vectors in a matter-of-fact voice. Real storms, the ones that pull at the heart, have no predictable charts. He flew routes as if the autopilot could steer him through shame and worry. In the cabin, passengers slept or scrolled or read. They had no idea the plane carried more than luggage. He performed the checks, kept a steady back, and said the things a captain must say. But every small announcement felt like a performance played to a room that might one day judge the actor harshly. Would one signed page be enough to turn him into the problem they described? One evening, instead of going straight home, he detoured to the little park where he had taken Anna when she was tiny. The swings creaked in the cold air, each chain singing a thin note. He sat on a bench and watched a father push his child. The boy's laugh cut clean through the dull fog that had settled over Daniel. He thought about Jamal at the community center, about how the boy's questions kept finding him. Will people change, Captain? He had no tidy answer to give, only the ragged, honest one that came after losing a trust. Sometimes people break, and sometimes they break you. The thought made his throat sore. If he folded now, what lesson would he hand to Anna about standing for what is right? At his lowest, he visited his mother. She was gentle in the way older people are, a small lighthouse of ordinary steadiness. She closed the door behind him and put a kettle on without asking questions, as if some things were too big to name. Over tea, she touched his hand and said, "Your father used to say flying is not just about keeping the plane in the sky. It's about keeping a promise to yourself." He had heard those words 1,000 times, but now they landed like new. Promises were not only the contracts of work, they were the little truths you kept in the dark, to your child, to your own sense of right. Could he live with a bargain that bought comfort but sold his truth? The rock bottom was quiet. It came not as a collapse, but as a long, slow peel of layers. He missed calls from friends. He forgot to check the union's messages. He scrolled through the journalist's comments one night and tasted a bile of humiliation at how easily a man's name could be bent by someone else's keyboard. He felt exposed, foolish, tired. He sat at the kitchen table and pressed the silver cross into his palm until the cold became warmth. He thought of his father's rough handwriting on the encouragement card he had kept since his first flight test. He thought of Marta's bowl of soup and Grace's fierce promise. The map he had trusted, friendships, paperwork, proper channels, had holes in it. What kind of man would he be if he let a hole swallow the rest? Then something in him shifted. Not a sudden blaze, but a slow, determined clearing. The anger that had curled into defeat softened into focus. If the world would read the memo one way, he could make sure it read another. If people wanted a tidy resolution, he would force a clean truth on the paper they preferred. The decision was quiet and absolute. He would not accept the confidential settlement. He would not let the language of premium experience stand unchallenged. He would ask for the memo to be made public and would gather the witnesses whose signatures could not be bought by a promotion offer. His fight would be measured, not loud, because loud could be framed as hysteria, and measured truth was harder to smear. Could courage look like careful work rather than noise? That night Anna's recital felt like a line drawn across everything else. He had almost missed it when the mediation dragged, when his head ached from restless thinking. He left the house later than he promised. The streetlights smeared like slow comets. The auditorium smelled of varnish and nervous hairspray. Families sat in rows, a dozen tiny shoes tapping in tempo. Daniel slipped into the back and watched Anna climb onto the little bench at the piano. Her hands trembled in a way that made his heart both ache and swell. For a moment he felt the full weight of the choices he had made. If he fought this fight and lost his schedule, what concerts would he miss? If he folded now, what would he teach his daughter about standing? She played. The first notes were hesitant, then found a steady line. The melody unfolded like a small, brave bird testing the air. Daniel let himself listen in a way he had not allowed in months. When the final chord trembled into the quiet, the room burst. Anna's face turned toward the back, searching, and their eyes met. She mouthed a small, secret smile, the kind a child gives a parent who promised and kept it. In that instant something shifted inward. The fight was no longer only about dignity. It was about the kind of legacy he would leave. Would he teach her to pick comfort or to hold a hand to the truth? He left the auditorium with a steadier step. The rock bottom had cracked open into a hinge. Alone in the car, he made a list on the back of an envelope. Union contact, legal counsel, requests for internal communications, witness affidavits, a press strategy that kept facts first. He would call Marcus and Marta first. He would ask Grace to go public if needed. He would not run to anger, but to careful, persistent action. The inner decision was simple and unglamorous. Bear the cost if it meant a clearer sky for Anna and for the hundreds of quiet people who might face the same small cruelties. Could one man's stubbornness tilt a policy that had been written in rooms far from the cabin? He did not know. But for the first time since the sign paper, he felt certain enough to try. Daniel's list on the envelope became a plan written in fuller sentences. He woke with a single thought: move with care, not noise. The 7-day clock on the settlement hung over him like a low cloud. He could feel the deadline like a small, steady pressure, a time to act or a time to accept the quiet bargain. He started by calling Marcus and Marta, then the union lawyer who had promised help. Each call was short, practical. Each one closed with a promise to meet and to gather what was needed. Witness statements, the saved video, timestamps, and the chain of internal memos Marcus had already begun to compile. The map was taking shape. Could careful steps outmatch the tidy machinery of corporate spin? Marta arrived at Daniel's kitchen table with a stack of handwritten notes and a tired look that had something like resolve in it. "I kept the napkin you signed," she said, sliding it across the wood. "And I copied down the names of the crew who were there but quiet. Some of them are scared to come forward. They fear being punished." Her voice trembled only a little. She had been steady on the plane. Now she was steady in a different way. She told him she could get more statements if Daniel asked, if he promised to protect them as best he could. He promised. The promise felt like a small lifeline, fragile, but real. Would enough people risk their jobs to tell the truth? Grace called in the next day with news that surprised him. She had connections in the local teachers' union and with a small community radio station that liked human stories. "People listen to stories they can hurt for," she said. "We can get this told without it being a circus." She offered to write a formal affidavit and to speak at a small, controlled interview if needed. Daniel felt his hopes swell. Community roots, he realized, might be the counterweight to polished corporate spokespeople. Would a teacher's voice matter more than a glossy press release? Marcus brought something heavier. An email chain that showed pressure sent down from a sales team member and replied to by a regional manager. It showed names and times and a strange shopping list of euphemisms: seating management, premium experience. The memos were the thinnest of truths, but they were still paper with ink. Marcus looked at Daniel and said quietly, "If we take this up publicly, we'll need more than anger. We need the whole trail." The lawyer suggested a formal request for internal documents under union procedures while preparing a small press package to release if HR closed ranks. The plan felt surgical, careful, and a little cold, but it was exactly the kind of thing that could stop the company from reshaping the story into something small. Could careful lawyering break a system that had learned to speak in soft euphemisms? Then Sarah called. The ring of her voice was small and uncertain. Daniel had expected silence or defensiveness. Instead, she spoke with the sound of someone unmade and trying to be remade. "I'm scared," she said before he could speak. "I did what they asked. I'm sorry." Her apology landed like a heavy stone and then broke into something softer. She told him about the private chat where attendants had traded tips and about a regional manager who had once visited and used the phrase, "protect what pays." Sarah said she had kept some messages she thought might help, but that sharing them felt like stepping off a cliff. Daniel felt something complex, anger and pity braided together. Could someone who had refused him water become the person who helped pull the thread tighter? She did more than offer words. Sarah met him at a neutral place, hands small and fidgeting, and handed over screenshots from the attendant group chat and a set of internal notifications that had been distributed quietly. "I didn't want to," she whispered. "I thought I was keeping things safe. I'm sorry." The messages were small and damning. A tone of permission to enforce front cabin standards, forwarded praise when attendants followed through, notes that suggested discretion. Marta's eyes filled when she read them. Daniel felt the world tip in a direction he had not been certain existed. The woman who had hurt him might now be the key, who opened the locked drawer. Was forgiveness possible if her evidence cost her everything? Ethan's absence tightened around these new moves like a cold ring. He did not return messages, and when Daniel pressed him face to face, he read the man's avoidance like a confession. Ethan claimed he had been pressured, that the offer had been too much for his family to refuse. Daniel listened and felt the valve of anger hiss open and then close. The betrayal was a wound that hummed, but Daniel could not let it consume the work ahead. He needed witnesses, not recriminations. Could he carry the weight of losing a friend and still ask others to stand beside him? The union lawyer arranged a small meeting with a reporter he trusted, someone who had not taken sensational angles in the past. They presented facts. The video, the memo chain Marcus had supplied, Sarah's screenshots and witness statements from Marta and a couple of crew members who had signed affidavits. The reporter listened, asked precise questions, and then said something surprising. "If we publish this, we need a plausible narrative that points to a system, not just one bad employee. The public responds to patterns." Her tone was careful and honest. Daniel felt the plan shift subtly. This would not be just about him. It would be about the way a company wrote instructions that let prejudice become action. Could a story about language change how ordinary people thought about policy? They set a date to release the package should HR refuse to act. But there was a secondary, human move Daniel would not let go of. He asked Grace to come with him to Anna's next school meeting and to meet his mother, to root the fight in faces, in a teacher who believed in fairness, in a mother who had taught him right from wrong. It was a small, deliberate act. Show human details, not just memos. When people saw the man behind the complaint, the father, the teacher, the neighbor, the risk of corporate smoothing felt higher for the company. Would the story land differently when it had a child and a mother at its heart? The days blurred in documents and quiet meetings. Sarah's cooperation came with costs. She lost respect from some peers and had to answer hard questions at work. Marta found a new steadiness, but her nights were full of worry about what would happen to the crew who spoke up. Marcus's email trail gave the plan momentum, and Grace's community ties meant the story would not live only in a newsroom. Ethan's betrayal still smoldered, but Daniel learned to walk with a hurt in a pocket and the plan in his hands. The deadline approached like weather on the horizon. Could careful strategy, community backing, and reluctant allies bend the system that had tried to hide behind soft phrases? He did not know. He only knew he would try. The hearing room smelled of coffee and paper and the tired perfume of people who had rehearsed their faces for weeks. Cameras lined the back like mute judges. Daniel sat at the table with a stack of papers, affidavits, the saved video, Marcus's email chain, Sarah's screenshots. Across from him, the airline's legal team arranged their pens like soldiers. The regional vice president, James Whitaker, sat near the front with a careful, polite face that practiced surprise whenever the room leaned toward anger. Daniel stood when called. His voice was even. His hands did not shake. "I will tell the truth," he said simply, the sentence carrying a weight that silenced rustling papers. The reporter who had promised careful coverage was there, notebook open. Grace sat in the gallery. Fingers knotted. Marta and Sarah sat close enough to touch. Sarah's eyes were red but steady. Ethan watched from across the room, his face a small, pale thing that might have been guilt or calculation. Daniel could not know. The first wave of testimony was clinical. Times, memos, the save clip. The union lawyer guided witnesses with precise questions. Marta described the cabin that morning in a voice that did not try to inflame. She only described what she had seen and done. Grace told the court why she had written a statement and how she had come to watch a man stand for himself on a plane. The room listened and wrote. It felt like careful work, the kind that could bend a large thing by patient pressure. Then the airline's counsel rose and tried to narrow the picture. This was a confusing interaction, he said. Policy language was vague. No one intended discrimination. He smiled in the unemotional way of people trained to remove heat from a conversation. "We are committed to fairness and will conduct a review." James Whitaker nodded like a man agreeing to a small storm and nothing more. Daniel felt the floor tremble under that easy denial. He had hoped the memo trail and the video would be enough. He had not counted on denials wrapped in corporate calm. He watched the faces in the room for something that could not be rehearsed, a crack, a hint of honest fear. The crack came from an unexpected place. Lillian, the operations rep who had boarded the jet that morning and later filed a polite report, stood quietly near the back. For days, no one expected her to speak. She had been helpful then and above board in emails. Now she walked forward with a thin envelope and a small recorder pressed into her palm like a confession. "I'm here because I kept something I shouldn't have," she said. Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not. "I was told to forward reports to an inbox that never looked at them. I was asked to keep things routine. I recorded a call once because I wanted to remember the exact words. I didn't know what would happen until I heard everything played back in a newsroom this week and realized someone needed to hear it." The room leaned in the way a ship leans into wind. Whitaker's practiced face was suddenly unreadable. Lillian pressed play. The recorder offered a voice not meant for public ears. Whitaker's, calm and deliberate, telling operations staff in a conference call, "We need measurable action. Keep our premium clients satisfied. Encourage the crew to manage seating. Use soft enforcement where needed. Don't make it a PR issue. Handle quietly." The words had the slow cruelty of someone who thought policy could be a needle. There were other voices in the recording, managers agreeing, laughing softly at the idea that ambiguity could protect them. Silence after the recording felt like a deep pause after an emergency. James Whitaker's jaw tightened. He sputtered at first, denials that landed like brittle glass. "That call was taken out of context," he said. "I meant customer service in general. There was no instruction to discriminate. But the tape had a cadence and a name and a meeting time." The union lawyer played a second clip, this one with Whitaker's follow-up email. "Protect premium customers. Implement seating management as necessary." The two pieces braided into evidence that the policy was not an accident. The final twist tightened like a vice. Lillian revealed that after she recorded the call, she had been offered a promotion by a different regional director if she stayed quiet. She had been tempted. She had nearly accepted. But watching the public conversation and meeting Daniel's steady, tired face at the press conference had made her change her mind. "I realized they would let people like him pay for our silence," she said. "I could not be part of it." People shouted then, not loud, but sharp. Whitaker stood, red rising in his neck, and the airline's counsel faltered. The CEO, Robert Hale, who had watched from a glass office and now sat in the hearing like a man taking the measure of his company, cleared his throat and asked for a moment. He left and returned with a statement that had the shape of someone deciding between damage control and truth. "I am sorry," he said plainly. "We failed our passengers and our employees." The language in internal communications allowed for interpretation, and that was wrong. "We will institute immediate policy changes, an independent review, and disciplinary action where appropriate." His voice wavered one beat on the last words, then steadied. It was not a resignation. It was an apology that opened a door. Daniel watched Whitaker escorted from the room by 2 security officers. The man's face was a mask that did not match the recorded voice that had guided decisions into darkness. Ethan sat very still. Daniel felt anger flare and then fold into something more complicated. The machine that made the choice was still larger than one man's fall. When the hearing broke, people gathered in small knots. Reporters asked questions that smelled of headlines. The union filed for independent oversight. The airline promised transparent policy rewrites. Sarah approached Daniel at the exit, tears streaking her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she said 4 times, like a chant. Daniel looked at her and felt the braid of anger and pity tighten. She had harmed him. She had also helped open the door. "Thank you," he said finally, the word small, exhausted, and true, "for telling the truth." Outside, Grace hugged him as if she could press the hurt into the pavement and leave it there. Marta put a steady hand on his shoulder. Marcus gave him a look that said the fight would continue. Daniel thought of Anna waiting at home, of Jamal at the community center, and of the kind of world he wanted to leave for them. The climax had resolved in a way he had not expected. The human cost was visible. The policy would change. The man who had pushed it would fall. But the larger question remained. Would the company truly become different, or would it learn a new language to hide old actions? What would you do if you found the system stacked against fairness? Daniel had won a battle, but the war was only beginning. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.